Hello, my name is Cadet Strickland. I'll be presenting on the Battle of Mogadishu, which is otherwise known as Black Hawk Down. This is a pivotal battle in terms of how it affected American foreign policy and how we intervene in international humanitarian efforts. Let's get on to a little more background information. So, Siad Barre, he was a long-standing dictator in Somalia. He took power in the mid-1960s and had held that power with a pretty much iron fist until he was forced out of power in 1991 by different warlords in Somalia. And it's important to note that culturally, Somalia is made up of multiple areas with tribes, each tribe typically ruled by a single warlord. So they don't really have a single national identity, and that's what gave them problems leading up to this conflict and even to the present day. So after Barre was thrown out, two major factions emerged that were vying for power. That was the Somalia National Movement and Aidid's party. Aidid's going to be a key character in what leads to the Battle of Mogadishu. So this internal fighting results in chaos in the capital and across the country due to the power vacuum that was left when Barre was ousted. So here you can see a map of Somalia. It's broken up. You can see Puntland up in the northeast and also in the northwest, Somaliland. So you can see how it's broken up into different groups. The capital, Mogadishu, is down in the southeastern coast of Somalia. So the conflict not only led to some serious humanitarian situations, but also a drought. In the year leading up to this, 1991, 1992, there was a severe drought, so bad that most of the arable land in Somalia could not be farmed, and even the little bit that could be farmed, most of those farmers had been run out by warring factions, by the warlords fighting. So they had almost zero food production. This led to millions of people having to deal with starvation and around 300,000 dying. And this is before the Battle of Mogadishu. The numbers increased afterwards. So this led to one of the largest humanitarian crises that we'd seen internationally, and the United States and United Nations felt that they needed to get involved. So this leads to the UN coming into it. So in August of '92, the UN begins a humanitarian relief effort known as UNISOM 1, which means United Nations Operations in Somalia 1. Basically, this was purely humanitarian. The UN was sending in massive amounts of food, tons of food, enough that it would alleviate the starving that was going on and start saving lives. However, due to the civil war that was going on, all the warlords were stealing this food aid. It was estimated about 80% of all the aid brought was taken. And what did they use this for? In addition to feeding their troops, they used it to trade with other nations for arms. So they were selling the food aid to get themselves weapons to fight. So the UN saw that this was not a viable solution, and they sought aid from member states, particularly military assistance to help defend humanitarian operations. So the US sees this and decides to get involved. The current president was George H.W. Bush, and he sent in around 25,000 troops to Mogadishu as part of the United Nations International Task Force, UNITAF, and this was known as Operation Restore Hope. So here they were getting involved militarily to try and secure that food aid so that it could get to the people that needed it, and it could save the lives and prevent this crisis from growing to larger proportions. Now, this is happening at the end of Bush's term, and in the election leading up to 1993, President Clinton or then candidate Clinton, president-elect, he was critical of George H.W. Bush. He wanted to see things wind down. He didn't think that we necessarily needed to be there. Um, but he still tried to carry out and finish things. So things shift a little bit. We move from United Nations International Task Force to UNISOM 2, UN International, UNISOM 2. So the UN held meetings with warlords from all the factions and tried to agree upon some sort of government to settle this power vacuum. They decided to create a representative federalist type government, but it's important to note what I heard from some of the diplomats in interviews was that these warlords, especially Adid, they could be very statesmanlike and willing to compromise, willing to agree. However, they would kind of change their opinion on a dime. So if you offended them or if they just were feeling grumpy that day, they changed their mind. And this is going to come into play soon. But the UN was directly involved in this and called it nation building. They wanted to disarm the fighting factions, bring back order to the land, and help the people set up a government. And this was all done to try and solve this starvation crisis. There had to be order for farmers to be able to go back to work and people be able to eat, which was the main issue that got everyone, the UN, the US, and all our nations involved. And the troop number had increased from 25 to 28,000 troops from a total of 36 different countries. Now here's the main antagonist, Mohammed Farah Adid. He was a prominent warlord leading one of the factions that was vying for power. And he had been fairly agreeable up to this point, June 5th. So there were around 4,000 Pakistani soldiers in Somalia, and there was a small group that were out, and a group of local Somalis thought that this group of about 24 Pakistani soldiers were trying to disable a radio station, which was proven to be false later, but these locals killed, basically executed 24 Pakistani soldiers, and this was not seen as acceptable in any way whatsoever, and the UN put out a resolution saying, quote, take all necessary measures against those responsible for the armed attacks, which was a deed. So this increases conflict. U.S. troops start going on missions, specifically raids, to take out high key personnel in Adid's faction. And while this is happening, you start to see some civilian casualties. There's starting to be some Somalis that are in the wrong place at the wrong time and are killed as a result, unfortunately. So these civilian casualties angered the warlords. Basically, everyone in Somali is becoming angered at the UN and specifically the US for their involvement here and starting to resent it. So this is where a Task Force Ranger comes in. So President Clinton got together Task Force Ranger. It was a fairly small group made up of highly skilled personnel. It included a battalion from the 75th Ranger Regiment, as well as an entire squadron of Delta Company operators. And there were also some Navy SEALs, DevGru, and Air Force paratroopers. So this was a small group made up of the best that were intended to carry out these special missions. So moving into the time of the battle, October 3rd and 4th, 93, intelligence had picked up intel that Adid was going to be in the Olympic Hotel in Mogadishu with fellow lieutenants of his making plans. So with this in mind, Task Force Ranger was sent out to conduct a raid to capture Adid and any of his high-ranking officials that they could take with them. So this was initially going to be just a 30-minute raid in and out using Black Hawk helicopters and AH-1 Cobras, but it didn't turn out this way. So in actuality, Adid was not at the building. And the people in Mogadishu, with all the anger and angst that they were building up towards U.S. personnel, they decided to fight back. So very quickly into this operation on October the 3rd, RPGs were targeted, taking down initially one Black Hawk helicopter. Several of the crew of that helicopter were killed, some were injured and still on site, and this created a terrible situation. Instead of the 30-minute raid, now it was a rescue mission in this city where there's thousands of armed Somalis that are very angry at U.S. personnel. A second UH-60 was also shot down. So now, as it progressed, you have two rescue operations underway in the city. So while these men are pinned down at these downed helicopters, the Somalis are building up in large groups armed with RPGs and AK-47s and attempting to attack those few Americans. One of the helicopters, the pilot was alive but injured, and the Somalis, after hours and hours of fighting, were able to kill the other Americans defending that helicopter and took this pilot alive. And then it turned into a hostage situation. So it took a total of about 18 hours to get everyone out. Humvees had been waiting to go pick up Adid if he had been captured and any other officials. So with some fighting by the members of Task Force Ranger that were not on that raid, they were able to clear routes eventually and pick up those who were wounded. And then later, 11 days later, the captured pilot was brought back. So in the aftermath, 8 U.S. troop members were reported dead, and that number actually got up to 18 with around 80 wounded. Now, over 500 Somalis, militia and civilians, were dead. Some estimates run up to as many as 1,000 dead. And one of the Delta Force operators that was interviewed noted that when these Somalis would bunch up, they would sort of have assembly areas at intersections ready to go and try and attack these downed helicopters. We still had helicopters in the air, so when they would mass up like that, these helicopters with miniguns would just go strafe them. And he said they'd kill 20, 30, 40 at a time and just do this over and over again. So it was a large amount of carnage on the part of for the Somalis. And this looked really bad. The United States populace immediately did not enjoy this. They wanted the troops out. They didn't think they needed to be there with it moved this far. So the manhunt for Adid was called off, and U.S. diplomats were sent to negotiate with warlords. So long term, this had some serious effects on policy. One phrase, "not crossing the Mogadishu line," was coined after this. And what that means is that it's not a physical line, but the line between a humanitarian effort and a military operation with combat involved. Basically that, don't get involved in a humanitarian effort if it's going to lead to this massive death of both U.S. lives and the lives of the people that you're trying to help. It escalated to a situation that never should have got to, and that's something that is noted now and that the U.S. has followed in policy following that. One specific result of this was just a year later in 1994, the Rwandan genocide. So the Clinton administration had known about this, what the situation was becoming in Rwanda, but chose not to get involved mainly because of what had happened in Somalia. And so as a result of this, around 500,000 Rwandans were killed in a genocide, one of the greatest modern genocides that we've seen. So it's had a direct effect on policy of the U.S. in a foreign setting. This is the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening.